bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 110. We're talking about socialism today in the context of Sweden. Seeing Bernie Sanders and others praise these, Scandinavian countries as having functional socialism, I thought, you know what? We're going to talk to my friend Klaus. So Klaus Bernpaintner is a Swede, a libertarian in Sweden. He's the senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Sweden. He produces the Mises Radio podcast. He is our go-to guy to determine is Sweden some socialist utopia? Is, in fact, the United States perhaps in some ways more socialist than Sweden? We want to kind of unpack these questions. Klaus, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Connor. Glad to be here.
So let's do an introductory question first. How is it that there can be libertarians in Sweden? How did you kind of come to your political understanding that you now have?
Okay, it's a long story, but let me summarize it thus. I worked in finance and up to the crisis of 2007 and 2008, which in some sense is still ongoing. And I had this fancy education, so did my fellow coworkers, but none of us could foresee the crash. So I was not being happy with that. I looked around to see if anybody had figured it out. And of course, there were voices and people who had predicted. And I wanted to know what kind of theory that they had that made them see this coming. And somehow I heard of this Austrian economics thing, and I had never heard of it. I started to read some of it. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't understand it. But eventually I came around to understanding, and that helped me see that the problem is the government. The same government that tells us that it's necessary for the order of the economy and society in general is actually what's causing the crises. And then I expanded my thinking and said, wait, here it says it's necessary for the economy, but it's actually destroying it. Is it perhaps so that the same is true of other areas of society? And then, of course, the whole thing fell apart. And yeah.
Now, in America, there's this tradition of, laissez-faire capitalism and individualism and free markets in kind of the culture and the ethos, at least in kind of the founding of America. And that was always the vision, the rugged West. People could kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so even though I would argue that America has now heavily drifted towards socialism, there's very much this kind of foundational affinity for, the free markets. Talk to me about what it's like in Sweden. What is the culture there like? And how does that affect the policies today in terms of socialism?
Trying to characterize Sweden socialism as an economic system, I would probably say that Sweden is more of a welfare state. It's very heavily characterized by government welfare, taking care of you from cradle to grave, and what that has done to people. So it's hard to say if Sweden is socialist. Of course, it's socialist in many ways, but it's kind of a multidimensional problem. So it's very socialist in some, healthcare and schooling and unemployment benefits, all run by government. But in other parts, it's perhaps less statist than the U.S. But the welfare state has done great damage to the mentality of Swedes. Of course, it's also a geographical problem. The further away you get from big cities, the more libertarian-minded people are. Because the closer you are to a city, the more you expect somebody else to take care of you. But if you live in the country, then you're more used to solving your own problems or working together with the neighbors to solve your problems. So,
is that the same in Sweden? Are there kind of rural areas where you find more independent-minded people?
Absolutely. If you go way up north, then it's I sometimes call it the Texas of Sweden. It's people are used to taking care of themselves, and there's hardly any cops around. And if you go to the south of Sweden, it's quite conservative, for example. But same in Sweden as in the U.S. The closer you get to bigger cities, the more socialist it becomes.
So how does that affect the culture? I mean, you've spent time in the United States, and obviously you're from and currently live in Sweden. And so what does that do for the overall culture of people? You've probably seen similar trends in America, but talk to us about the culture of Sweden as it pertains to kind of this safety net, reliance on, welfare system to take care of you. Does that affect the productivity rate? Does that affect kind of the morality? What does the culture look like as impacted by these policies from your view?
It affects morality, and it affects the bonds between within families and across generations. It's highly toxic, destructive to the societal fabric. And it usually goes over a few generations. So one generation, they decide to create political solutions for caring for old people, or healthcare. Instead, there's always been solutions, and they've been more local. Like villages have taken care of their own poor and their own sick. But for some reason, at some point, they decided this is a national problem. Okay. So now the government takes care of healthcare. And initially, people have their original morality, and they kind of say that, okay, this is only for people who really have no other means of taking care of themselves. This should not be abused. It's immoral to use it. The next generation says, this has always been around, and I don't know of any sacrifices that have been made to create this, and hey, if it's there, why not use it?
Why not benefit from it?
Yeah. And at that point, it's, once you get on, it's a very slippery slope. Once you get onto this, and once you're that far, it's, I would say, bankruptcy is the only way out, really.
Now, one allegation I've heard is that the only reason that Sweden can currently support such a large welfare state is that it, in decades past, had a very robust capitalist system that allowed the state to kind of enrich itself and thereby provide a financial foundation of sorts that might support a little better these type of welfare programs. Is there any truth to that?
That's always how socialism works. It works for a while because it feeds upon accumulated wealth, but it destroys it over time, and eventually it goes bankrupt. And I haven't seen any other ways, any other developments than that, and that's of course how it is in Sweden too. Sweden used to be very libertarian, very free market oriented, and a highly moral society. And then in the 30s, there was a couple, very influential couple called Myrdal. Gunnar Myrdal shared the so-called prize in economics, a Nobel Prize for economics, with Hayek, ironically. And he was the big welfare architect of Sweden, he and his wife. And they have had enormous influence over the Swedish welfare state. And even through this time, up until the 60s, in the 60s, that's actually when the things started to become very socialist and very high taxes to pay for all these programs that had been started since the 30s. And towards the end of the 60s, it kind of went downhill from there. And in the 90s, there were tax reforms. So, this system got some more breathing air. But then it's been downhill from there again.
Now, you talked about this kind of familial impact and cross-generational impact. My wife lived in Sweden for a period of time, about a decade and a half ago, and one of her observations was that it was very, very, very rare to see a family in Sweden in which the mother was remaining in the home to take care of the children. Now, you can make your observation or your opinion about whether, female empowerment and women want to be in the workforce or whatever. But as a larger trend, it was interesting for her to notice the stark difference from her own community that she was used to, in which mothers were often in the home taking care of the children so that they weren't being raised by the television or, school programs, government services. And then she goes to Sweden and sees that from her observation, due to the high tax burden, it required both adults, both parents working in order to bring in enough post-tax income for the family, which meant the mother had to be out working, which meant the children were being kind of raised by other people or by the system. Was her observation at all accurate? It may have been her own experience in a very limited setting where she was in Sweden. Talk to me about whether that's kind of the case for Sweden more broadly.
It is very much the case, and that is one of the examples of how the welfare state destroys society. Mothers or parents are expected, when their child is 1 year old, to turn it in for government training in daycare. And because you already pay for this through taxes, and the taxes are so high, you're forced to go to work, more or less. I mean, you can still go your own way, but it's a big sacrifice. So you already pay for this, you might as well turn in your children and everybody go to work so you can pay for all the free stuff. So I would say 95%, if not even more, of 1 year olds are turned into the government for education.
And then, of course, the quote-unquote education they received is no doubt reinforcing the very system that they're now a part of, right?
Absolutely.
So,
that's another sort of parent-child aspect is the so-called free parental leave. So if you have a child, you can, with part of your income, part of your salary paid by the government, you can stay home with your children for 2 years. Not full paid, but part of your salary. Mm-hmm. And people go, wow, that is so generous in Sweden. Of course, you and I know that there's nothing free, because somebody always pays, and we pay heavy taxes, depending on how you compute them and what your tax situation is. Some people have come up with numbers like 65-70% of your taxes of your income goes into taxes to pay for all the free stuff.
Now, having now spent both time in both countries, the United States of America and Sweden, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want you to make a comment about in what ways is the United States as socialist as Sweden? I think a lot of conservatives see, Bernie Sanders and others talk about how great socialism in Sweden. The people on the right side of the aisle say, oh, no, we don't want to be like those countries. From your perspective, how close to Sweden is the United States already?
And before I answer that, let me just finish the other point. I just want to add one more thing.
Sure.
This goes on to the next generation. The way the parents turn in their kids to the government, that's how the children, when they grow up, turn in their old parents to the government for so-called care, in most cases abuse. And instead of taking your children or your parents home when they are abused, you write, letters to the editor complaining about the bad service but not doing anything yourself about it. So you just let somebody else solve the problems. Anyway, the U.S. How is the U.S. socialist? I would say I met many people who want to go down the way of Sweden, the way they've understood it. It's also socialist in a way that you trust the government to fix problems for you. Oh, healthcare is bad. Let's have more government get into healthcare. Let's have more government regulation to fix it. So the same kind of problem, not seeing what the actual root cause of the problem is, but just throw more government into it and it will be okay. So in that way, you've also been conditioned in a way. Mm-hmm. But there are other statist aspects of the U.S. that I didn't appreciate, that I don't appreciate so much. It's more Americans are more afraid of their government than Swedes are.
Interesting.
The Swedish government is lame in many ways. It's very naive because it's so socialist. It's also very materialist and secular. And every time I see secularism, I also see, highly naive people. And because Sweden is so naive, it also has a weak government in that sense. So we're not afraid of our police. Of course, there's abuse here too, but police are more incompetent than they are dangerous. We also don't have that statist military worship aspect to the Swedish society, like the way you have in the U.S. You go to a sports game and there's military
national anthem. Yeah. Let me ask this then, because it seems to me that you're basically saying, in many ways, both countries have these heavy socialist type welfare policies. But in many ways, the United States has this whole other baggage of statism that Sweden does not. So where you've spent significant time in both countries, where do you feel more free? In which country?
I generally feel more free in the U.S.
And why is that?
Because at least I get to decide for my family. I have more freedom. I can choose the education for my children. I can even choose to educate them at home. I can protect them from government indoctrination. Homeschooling in Sweden is criminal. If you do it, they take your kids and they put you in jail. Many families have fled Sweden. There's a neighboring island between Sweden and Finland. They speak Swedish, but they're part of Finland. They've actually moved there to school their children. That is a very, very dangerous, I think, part of this kind of socialism. Also, U.S. healthcare is expensive because of government meddling, but it's still more. At least if I sell my house, I can get healthcare. In Sweden, I can sell whatever I want. I can sell my children. I still don't get public healthcare. Of course, now they're coming more and more private insurance solutions, so you kind of bypass the government wait times. I mean, if you don't have private healthcare insurance here, it's still kind of a new thing to many people. Of course, the politicians have had it for a long time. They don't trust their own public healthcare, but for the rest of us, it's kind of a new thing. And of course, it's a big unfairness. People are talking about unfairness. Swedes are very focused on what's fair and unfair and so on. But at least healthcare in the U.S. was still more available. I can choose my doctor. If I don't like the doctor, I go take another one. Here you go to these government healthcare facilities. And once I called them, I was supposed to say, well, you should have called last week and booked an appointment. Yeah, but I'm sick today. Yeah, but we're full today and tomorrow and the rest of the week. So
wow.
And people are dying waiting for healthcare. I mean, some place, if you're lucky, you get a good doctor and you live in an area where where the lines for cancer treatment aren't that long, and you have a doctor who actually cares, despite not having much of an incentive. And then you're okay. You can find good healthcare, but as a general rule, you're in the hands of bureaucrats.
Klaus, I've got one more question before we go, and that is, where you've been involved with the Mises Institute in Sweden and trying to advocate the ideas of liberty. Talk to me about what that's like. Do you find that there are people who are open-minded in Sweden, or is kind of this heavy indoctrination difficult to work with in terms of getting people to see your point of view?
The indoctrination is very heavy because there is only one school and one curriculum for all. And as you said, it's self-reinforcing. We're always taught how lucky we are to have this, free schooling and free everything. And in the U.S., people starve in the streets and they don't get education and healthcare. So it's for somebody to take the step out of that and think critically. Of course, the school, that's another fun thing. A very important part of school is to learn to think critically, critical thinking. Of course, it's a very controlled form of critical thinking. So it's hard for people to get out of that mindset that they've been so heavily indoctrinated with. But the chickens of socialism are coming home to roost, and people are seeing what is happening to the fabric of our society. It's actually a very, very interesting time in Sweden right now. We have there's an election coming up in September, in just a month. And I think there's going to be a lot of change. There's so much discontentment and anger against the establishment right now. So this is actually an interesting time to be a libertarian and promoting the alternatives idea of liberty. Hey, what if we took care of our own lives for a change? Our own money and our own lives, you know.
A lot of opportunity.
There's a lot of opportunity right now, and the podcast that we've been running has been very successful in attracting people to these ideas.
I failed to mention, Klaus, at the outset of the podcast that you also are the translator for the Tuttle Twins books into Swedish, and so together we're trying to kind of counteract that child indoctrination in Sweden, one family at a time.
Yeah, and as I said, it's a very interesting but frustrating, but interesting time, definitely.
Well, we'll be watching closely, if for nothing else, then as goes Sweden, so may go United States in some ways. So.
Well, that's what kind of depressing to me when I was in the United States, because I saw these. How people wanted this without knowing where it leads. You have to, go to Sweden, live there for a year before asking for this thing.
Yeah.
It's death.
Well, that's a sad, morose note to end on.
Yeah, but
it is, right? It's a stark warning as to the consequences of people's grandiose.
Don't destroy
visions.
your country. Don't destroy it.
Klaus, thank you very much. It's important insights for many of us to have a better picture as to kind of what things look like a little further down the road than we ourselves are. Klaus Bernpaintner, Senior Fellow of Ludwig von Mises Institute, Sweden, translator of the Tuttle Twins books into Swedish, all-around good guy. Klaus, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Connor. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.